The orc woman's hands were still dusted with flour from the morning bread when she mentioned, almost carelessly, that she had never known what day she was born. Zachary Quinlan paused in the doorway of their small farmhouse, the summer sun warm on his shoulders, and felt something shift in his chest. They had been married exactly one day. The ceremony had been quiet, witnessed by a handful of neighbors in the village square, and Verity Norton had worn a simple dress of undyed linen that made her green skin seem to glow. Now she stood at the table they would share for all the years ahead, kneading dough with strong, capable hands, and she spoke of her childhood as if it were nothing remarkable. "Ma and Pa died when I was small," she said, not looking up from her work. "Fever took them both in the same week. The clan had too many mouths already. No one thought to remember when I came into the world." Zachary set down the bucket of well water he had been carrying. He was a man of few words, had been all his life, and the right ones never came easily. But he had learned in the months of courting Verity that silence could be its own kind of answer. He crossed the wooden floor and placed one hand briefly on her shoulder, felt the warmth of her through the fabric, then moved to stoke the morning fire. Verity smiled at him, a quick flash of tusks, and returned to her bread. She did not seem to expect anything more, but Zachary could not let it rest. He thought about it through the morning chores, feeding the chickens and mending the fence in the south pasture, where the posts had rotted over winter. He thought about it while Verity hung laundry on the line, her black hair tied back with a strip of cloth, singing something low and rhythmic in the orcish tongue. The sun climbed higher and the day grew hot, and by the time they sat down to a simple lunch of cheese and yesterday's bread, Zachary had made his decision. He would give her a birthday. The difficulty was that Verity would notice if he simply announced a celebration. She was observant in ways that surprised him, always had been, even when they first met at the autumn market in the village. She had been selling smoked fish from the river, and he had been selling apples from his small orchard, and their stalls had been side by side for 3 days. He remembered how she had caught him staring, not with offense but with a frank curiosity that made him look away, embarrassed. By the 3rd day she had spoken to him first, asking about his trees, and he had managed to answer without stammering. The courtship that followed had been slow and careful. Zachary was not the kind of man who rushed into things, and Verity seemed content with patience. They walked together on Sunday afternoons when the work was done. They sat by the river and talked about small things, the weather and the harvest, and the way the geese flew south in great noisy flocks. Zachary learned that Verity had come to the village 5 years before, alone and looking for work. She had taken a small cottage at the edge of the settlement and made her living by fishing and tanning hides. The villagers had been wary at first, as people always were of orcs, but Verity was quiet and kept to herself and never caused trouble. Over time, the wariness had faded into a grudging tolerance, and then, for some, into a cautious friendliness. But tolerance was not the same as acceptance, and Zachary knew there would be complications. That afternoon, while Verity went to check her fishing lines downstream, Zachary walked into the village. The settlement was small, perhaps 40 families in all, clustered around a central square with a well and a meeting house. The farms spread out from there in a patchwork of fields and pastures, bounded by forest on 3 sides and the river on the 4th. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where gossip traveled faster than a horse could run, and where a stranger could live for a decade and still be called new. Zachary found Martin Quad at the blacksmith's forge, hammering out a new plowshare. Martin was a big man with arms like tree trunks and a face perpetually reddened by heat and exertion. He and Zachary had known each other since boyhood, had learned to plow and plant side by side, and there was a trust between them that came from years of shared labor. "Need a word," Zachary said. Martin looked up, wiped sweat from his forehead, and set down his hammer. "What is it?" They stepped outside into the shade of an old oak. Zachary explained about Verity's never having celebrated a birthday, about his idea to give her one, and about needing help to make it happen without her knowing. Martin listened, his expression unreadable, then nodded slowly. "When were you thinking?" "A month from now." "Give me time to get people on board and make plans. She will notice if we are sneaking around, she will. But if we are careful, she will not know why." Martin rubbed his jaw, thoughtful. "You will need more than me. You will need food, decorations, people willing to come. Some folks still are not comfortable around her. I know. And then there is Garrett." Zachary felt his jaw tighten. Garrett Quincy was a distant cousin, a man who had also courted Verity the previous winter. He had been more forward than Zachary, more confident, and for a time it had seemed that Verity might choose him instead. But something had changed. Garrett had pressed too hard, had spoken of her as if she were a prize to be won rather than a person to be known, and Verity had quietly ended things. Garrett had not taken it well. At the wedding the day before, he had stood at the back of the small crowd with his arms crossed and his face like stone. "Garrett will cause trouble if he can," Martin said. "Maybe, but I have to try." Martin clapped him on the shoulder. "All right, I am in. Let me talk to Eleanor. She will know who else to ask." Eleanor Quad was Martin's wife, a practical woman with a gift for organizing. If anyone could pull together a village celebration, it was her. Zachary felt a flicker of hope. Over the next week, Zachary visited a dozen households. Some people agreed immediately, like old Peter Quill, who had always been kind to Verity and who promised to bring a keg of his best cider. Others were hesitant. Sarah Quinn, who ran the general store, frowned and said she would think about it. Thomas Quillan, a farmer whose land bordered Zachary's, asked bluntly why they should go to such trouble for an orc. "Because she is my wife," Zachary said, and his voice was quiet but firm. "And she deserves to be celebrated." Thomas did not answer right away, then finally nodded. "I will bring potatoes. Eleanor can roast them." It was not enthusiasm, but it was something. At home, Verity seemed to sense that Zachary was preoccupied, but she did not press him. She went about her work with the same steady competence she brought to everything, tending the garden and preserving early summer berries, and mending his shirts where the elbows had worn thin. In the evenings they sat together on the porch and watched the sun set over the western hills, and sometimes Verity would rest her head on his shoulder, and Zachary would think that he had never been so content. But contentment did not mean ease. The planning was harder than he had anticipated. Eleanor took charge with enthusiasm, drafting lists and assigning tasks, but not everyone was cooperative. A few families refused outright, saying they had no interest in celebrating an orc. Zachary tried not to let it anger him, but it did. He had spent his whole life in this village, had worked alongside these people, had helped them when they needed it, and now some of them would not do this one thing for him. "Let it go," Verity said one night, when he was too quiet and she guessed something was wrong. "You cannot change everyone." "I am not trying to change them. I am asking them to be decent." "Decent is a high bar for some people," she smiled, but there was sadness in it. Zachary took her hand. Her fingers were rough from work, the nails short and practical, and he held them gently. "You deserve better than decent." "I have you. That is enough." But it was not enough for Zachary. He wanted the village to see what he saw when he looked at Verity, her strength, her kindness, the way she worked without complaint and laughed at small joys. He wanted them to know her, not as the orc woman who lived at the edge of the settlement, but as Verity, a person with a name and a history and a future. The date Zachary had chosen was the 15th day of the 7th month, roughly a month after their wedding. It was an arbitrary choice, but Alina had suggested it because it fell on a Saturday, when most people would not be working in the fields. The plan was to hold the celebration in the village square in the late afternoon, after the day's labor was done. There would be food and drink, music if they could convince old Jonas Quinby to bring his fiddle, and a cake that Alina had promised to bake. The cake was important. Zachary had never seen Verity eat cake, and when he asked her once if she liked sweets, she had shrugged and said she did not know. She had never had much opportunity to find out. As the days passed, the preparations took shape. Martin built a long table from spare lumber and set it up in the square. Alina recruited a dozen women to cook, and the promise of roast chicken and fresh bread and berry pies began to circulate through the village. Zachary contributed a basket of early apples from his orchard, and Peter Quill rolled his cider keg into the meeting house to keep it cool. Slowly, reluctantly, the village began to come together. But Garrett Quincy was watching. Zachary did not see him often, but he heard things. Garrett had been asking questions, wondering aloud why there was so much activity in the village, why people were whispering and making plans. He had a way of inserting himself into conversations, of making people uncomfortable with his attention, and Zachary worried that he would figure out what was happening. 2 weeks before the celebration, Garrett came to Zachary's farm. It was late afternoon, and Zachary was splitting wood for the winter. Verity had gone to the river to check her traps, and the farmyard was quiet except for the rhythmic thunk of the axe. Garrett rode up on a brown mare, dismounted, and stood with his hands on his hips, watching. "Heard you have been busy," Garrett said. Zachary set down the axe and wiped his hands on his trousers. "What do you want, Garrett?" "Just curious. Seems like a lot of fuss for someone who has only been part of this village for a year." "She has been here 5 years, and she is my wife now." Garrett's expression hardened. "You know what people are saying, do you not? That you are making a mistake, that she will never really be one of us. People can say what they like. They are saying you are soft, that you let her twist you around." Zachary felt his temper rise, but he kept his voice level. "You need to leave." Garrett stepped closer. "I could have given her a better life. I have more land, more money, but she chose you, and I do not understand why. Maybe because I treated her like a person instead of a possession." For a moment Garrett looked as if he might say something else, something worse, but then he turned and mounted his horse. He looked down at Zachary, his face dark with anger, and said, "You will regret this." Then he rode away. Zachary stood in the yard for a long time after Garrett was gone, his heart pounding, his hands clenched into fists. He did not tell Verity about the visit when she came home, but he thought about it all through supper, and he lay awake that night wondering what Garrett might do. The answer came a week before the celebration. Zachary was in the village, picking up nails from Sarah Quinn's store, when he overheard 2 women talking in low voices near the counter. They did not see him at first, and their words carried. "Is it true?" one of them asked. "About the orc woman?" That is what Garrett said. He heard it from someone who knew her back east. She was involved in a raid, killed a man. Zachary stepped around the corner and both women jumped. "That is a lie," he said. One of the women, Martha Quilby, had the grace to look ashamed. The other, Helen Quinn, lifted her chin defiantly. "Garrett would not lie. Garrett is bitter because Verity turned him down. Whatever he is saying, it is not true." "How do you know?" Helen demanded. "How well do you really know her?" Zachary felt a surge of anger so strong it took his breath away. He wanted to shout, to tell them exactly how well he knew Verity, how she woke before dawn to tend the animals and never complained, How she sang while she worked and smiled at him when she thought he was not looking. How she had trusted him with her past and her fears and her quiet, careful hope for a future. But the words stuck in his throat as they always did, and all he could manage was, "Well enough." He paid for the nails and left without another word. When he got home, Verity was in the garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of beans. She looked up as he approached, and her smile faded. "What happened?" Zachary sat down on the edge of the porch and told her. About Garrett's visit, about the rumor, about the women in the store. Verity listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, and when he finished she was quiet for a long moment. "It is not true," she said finally. "The raid, I was never part of anything like that. I know. But people will believe it. They want to believe it. Not everyone." Verity pulled off her gloves and sat beside him. "You do not have to defend me, Zachary. I have lived with this my whole life. People will think what they think. I am your husband. Of course I have to defend you." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face, and then she leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you." They sat there together as the sun sank lower and the shadows grew long, and Zachary made a decision. He would not let Garrett ruin this. He would not let a lie steal away the one thing he wanted to give Verity, the one moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. He went back to the village the next day and found Martin at the forge. "Garrett is spreading a rumor," he said, and explained what he had heard. Martin's face darkened. "That bastard, what are you going to do?" "I am going to talk to everyone who is part of the celebration, make sure they know the truth. And if they do not believe you, then they do not come. But I am not canceling." Martin nodded. "Eleanor and I are with you. We will talk to people too." Over the next few days, Zachary and Martin and Eleanor went from house to house, confronting the rumor head-on. Some people were easily convinced. Old Peter Quill laughed and said he had known it was nonsense from the start. Others were harder to persuade. Thomas Quillan said he would still bring potatoes, but he would not promise to stay for the whole celebration. Sarah Quinn said she would come, but only because she did not want to be seen as taking Garrett's side. By the day before the celebration, Zachary had spoken to nearly everyone who had agreed to help, and most of them were still on board. But he knew there would be absences, people who had been scared off by the rumor, and it hurt more than he wanted to admit. The morning of the celebration dawned clear and bright. Zachary woke early, as he always did, and lay for a moment listening to Verity's breathing beside him. She was still asleep, her face peaceful, one hand curled under her cheek. He wanted to wake her to tell her what was going to happen, but he forced himself to get up quietly and dress. Verity stirred as he was lacing his boots. "Where are you going?" "Into the village. Martin needs help with something." It was not quite a lie, but it felt like one. Verity sat up, rubbing her eyes, and said, "I will come with you." "No," Zachary said too quickly. "I mean, it is just men's work. Boring, you should rest." Verity raised an eyebrow, but she did not argue. "All right, I will weed the garden." Zachary kissed her forehead and left before she could ask more questions. The village was already bustling when he arrived. The long table Martin had built was set up in the square, and women were covering it with cloths and setting out plates and cups. Eleanor was directing traffic, her voice brisk and efficient, and the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the air. Jonas Quinby was tuning his fiddle in the shade of the meeting house, and children were running underfoot, excited by the unusual activity. "Is she coming?" Eleanor asked when she saw Zachary. "Not yet. I told her I was helping Martin." "Good. We need another hour at least." Zachary helped where he could, carrying chairs from the meeting house and stringing up bunting that someone had sewn from scraps of colored cloth. The cake was already finished, a 2-layer confection with white frosting that Eleanor had decorated with wild strawberries. It sat on a side table, covered with a cloth, and Zachary felt a lump in his throat when he looked at it. As the afternoon wore on, people began to arrive. Some brought food, adding dishes to the already crowded table. Others just came to watch, curious and a little uncertain. Zachary counted heads and felt his stomach sink. There were fewer people than he had hoped. Maybe 20 families when he had been expecting 30. The absences were conspicuous. And then he saw Garrett. Garrett was standing at the edge of the square, his arms crossed, watching the preparations with a faint sneer. He had not been invited, but this was a public space, and there was no way to make him leave without causing a scene. Martin saw him too and moved to stand beside Zachary. "Ignore him. He is just trying to get a rise out of you. I know." But it was hard to ignore Garrett when he started talking. He moved through the crowd, speaking in a low voice to anyone who would listen. And Zachary could see people glancing at him, their faces uncertain. A few families who had just arrived hesitated, as if considering whether to stay. Alina marched over to Garrett and said something sharp that Zachary could not hear. Garrett laughed and said something back, and Alina's face went red. She turned on her heel and walked back to the table, her hands shaking. "We are ready," she said to Zachary. "Go get her." Zachary nodded and started toward home. His heart was pounding, a mix of excitement and dread. He did not know if the celebration would be everything he had hoped, but it was too late to turn back now. Verity was sitting on the porch when he arrived, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as he approached, and he saw suspicion in her eyes. "What is going on?" she asked. "Come with me." "Zachary, what did you do?" He held out his hand. "Please, just trust me." For a moment she did not move, and then she stood and took his hand. They walked together through the fields and down the road into the village, and with every step, Zachary felt his nerves winding tighter. What if she was angry? What if she did not want this? What if the whole thing was a disaster? But then they turned the corner into the square, and Verity stopped. The table was full of food, more than Zachary had ever seen in one place. There were roasted chickens and thick slices of ham, bowls of potatoes and beans and carrots, fresh bread and butter and jars of honey. There were pies and tarts and the cake, now uncovered, with its strawberries gleaming in the sun. And around the table were people, maybe not as many as Zachary had hoped, but enough. Martin and Alina, Peter Quill, Thomas Quillan, Sarah Quinn, Jonas Quinby, and a dozen others, all standing and watching as Verity took in the scene. "What is this?" Verity asked, her voice faint. Alina stepped forward. "It is your birthday, or it will be if you want it to be. Zachary told us you have never had one, and we thought it was time." Verity looked at Zachary, and he saw tears in her eyes. "You did this," he nodded, unable to speak. She turned back to the crowd, and for a moment no one moved. Then old Peter Quill started clapping, and one by one the others joined in until the square was filled with applause. Verity covered her mouth with her hands, and the tears spilled over, running down her green cheeks. "Come on," Alina said, taking her by the arm. "Sit, eat. This is your day." They guided Verity to a chair at the head of the table, and people began to fill plates and pass them around. Jonas Quinby started playing his fiddle, a lively tune that made the children dance, and the mood shifted from uncertain to festive. Verity sat in the middle of it all, looking dazed and overwhelmed, and Zachary sat beside her, his heart full to bursting. But Garrett was still there. He had moved closer now, and he was no longer bothering to keep his voice down. "This is a farce," he said loudly. "You are all celebrating a monster. Do you know what she did back east? She killed a man." The music stopped. People turned to stare. Verity stood, her face pale. "That is not true." "Is it not? Then why are you here, so far from where you came from? Why are you alone?" "Because my family is dead," Verity said, her voice shaking. Because I had nowhere else to go, I came here to start over, and I have worked for everything I have. I have never hurt anyone." Garrett laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And we are supposed to just take your word for it." Zachary stood too, his hands clenched. "You are supposed to leave." "Or what? You will make me." Before Zachary could answer, Martin stepped forward. "I will make you," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "And so will everyone else here. We know Verity. We have worked with her, traded with her, lived beside her. Whatever you are saying, it is a lie, and we all know it." "Do you?" Garrett looked around at the crowd. "All of you, you are sure?" There was a long, tense silence. Zachary held his breath, waiting, and then Thomas Quillan spoke. "I am sure," he said. "Verity helped me last winter when my barn roof collapsed. Spent 3 days in the cold helping me rebuild. Did not ask for anything in return." Sarah Quinn nodded. "She bought from my store and always paid fair, never caused trouble." "She mended my coat," said Martha Quilby, the woman who had been gossiping in the store. "Did a good job, too." One by one, people spoke up. Small things, most of them, but they added up. Acts of kindness, moments of decency, the quiet accumulation of trust. And as they spoke, Garrett's sneer faded, replaced by something uglier, something bitter and defeated. "You are all fools," he said finally, and he turned and walked away. No one stopped him. When he was gone, the tension broke. People started talking again, laughing, filling their plates. Jonas Quinby struck up another tune, and the celebration resumed as if Garrett had never been there. But Zachary could not let it end like that. He stood, tapping his cup with a spoon to get everyone's attention, and the square fell quiet again. "I am not good with words," Zachary began, and a few people chuckled. "But I want to say something. Verity has never had a birthday before. She has never had people gather to celebrate her, to tell her that she matters. And I thought that was wrong. I thought she deserved to know that she is valued, that she is part of this community, that she is loved." His voice cracked on the last word, and he paused, swallowing hard. Verity was staring at him, her eyes wide, and he made himself keep going. "She is the kindest person I know," he said. "She is strong and brave, and she works harder than anyone I have ever met. She makes me want to be better, and I am grateful every day that she chose me." He looked at the crowd, at the faces watching him, some moved, some smiling, some still uncertain. "So thank you," he said. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving her this." He sat down, his face burning, and for a moment there was silence. Then Alina started clapping again, and the applause was louder this time, more genuine. Verity reached for his hand under the table and squeezed it, and when he looked at her she was crying again, but she was smiling too. "Thank you," she whispered. They brought out the cake, and Alina explained that Verity was supposed to make a wish and blow out the candles. Verity laughed, a watery, joyful sound, and said she did not know what to wish for because she already had everything she wanted. But she closed her eyes and blew out the candles anyway, and everyone cheered. The cake was sweet and rich, and Verity ate 2 slices, declaring it the best thing she had ever tasted. Children ran around the square, playing tag and begging for more pie. Adults sat in clusters, talking and laughing, and as the sun sank lower the lanterns were lit, casting a warm glow over everything. Zachary sat beside Verity, his arm around her shoulders, and watched the village he had known all his life come together in a way he had not thought possible. It was not perfect. There were still people who had stayed away, still prejudices that would not disappear overnight. But it was something. It was a beginning. As the evening wore on, people began to leave, thanking Verity and Zachary and wishing them well. Peter Quill gave Verity a small wooden carving he had made, a bird with its wings spread. "For your mantle," he said. "So you remember today." Verity hugged him, and the old man blushed, By the time the last guests had gone, the square was dark except for a few lingering lanterns. Martin and Alina helped clean up, packing away leftover food and folding the tablecloths. Zachary and Verity walked home under a sky full of stars, their hands clasped, their steps slow. "I cannot believe you did that," Verity said. "I wanted you to have a birthday. I have never felt so loved." Zachary stopped walking and turned to face her. "You are loved, by me, by the people here. You are part of this place now." Verity kissed him, soft and lingering, and when they pulled apart she was smiling. "I do not know what I did to deserve you." "You did not have to do anything. You just had to be you." They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when they reached the farmhouse, Verity paused on the porch. "Do you think Garrett will cause more trouble?" "I do not know. But if he does, we will deal with it." Verity nodded, and they went inside. The days that followed were quieter. Zachary returned to his usual work, tending the orchard and repairing the chicken coop and cutting hay for winter. Verity went back to her fishing and tanning, but there was a lightness to her now, a joy that had not been there before. She hummed while she worked, and she smiled more often, and when people greeted her in the village she greeted them back with confidence. Garrett did not return. Zachary heard through Martin that he had left the village entirely, gone east to stay with relatives. Some people said he had been shamed into leaving, others that he had simply given up. Either way, Zachary was glad. The man had caused enough trouble. As summer turned to autumn, Verity's place in the village grew more secure. She was invited to help with the harvest, and she worked alongside the other women, laughing and joking as if she had been part of their circle for years. She and Alina became close friends, spending Sunday afternoons together, while Zachary and Martin worked on projects in Martin's barn. The children, who had been wary of her at first, now ran to greet her when they saw her, begging for stories about the river and the fish. One afternoon in late September, Zachary came home to find Verity sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a piece of paper. She looked up when he entered, her eyes bright. "What is that?" he asked. "An invitation. To Sarah Quinn's daughter's wedding. She wants me to come." Zachary smiled. "Of course she does. You are part of the village now." Verity set down the paper and stood, crossing to him. "Because of you, because you made them see me." "I did not make them do anything. They saw you on their own. I just gave them a reason to look." She wrapped her arms around him, and he held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. They stood like that for a long time, the autumn light streaming through the window, the world outside quiet and golden. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Verity said, "I have been thinking." "About what?" "About next year, about my birthday." Zachary raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "I think I would like to celebrate it again. The same day, make it official." "The 15th of the 7th month." "Yes, if that is all right with you." Zachary took her hand. "It is more than all right, it is perfect." Verity leaned her head on his shoulder, and they watched as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was cool, carrying the first hint of winter, but Zachary felt warm. He felt at peace. Winter came, as it always did, with snow and cold and long nights. Zachary and Verity spent the dark months close to the fire, mending tools and sewing clothes, and reading from the small collection of books they had accumulated. They visited Martin and Alina often, playing cards and sharing meals, and they were invited to other homes as well, a sign of acceptance that still surprised Verity every time. On the 15th of the first month, Verity told Zachary she was pregnant. He stared at her, the words not quite making sense, and then he laughed, a great booming laugh that made Verity laugh too. He picked her up and spun her around, and when he set her down he kissed her, long and deep, and said, "I love you. I love you too." The baby was born in the autumn, a girl with green skin and her father's dark eyes. They named her Violet Norton Quinlan, and she was welcomed into the village with gifts and blessings. Alina knit her a blanket, and Peter Quill carved her a rattle, and Sarah Quinn gave them a cradle that had been in her family for generations. Verity cried when she saw the cradle, and Sarah hugged her and said, "You are family now. This is what we do for family." On Violet's first birthday, the village gathered again in the square. It was smaller than Verity's celebration, more intimate but no less joyful. There was cake and music and laughter, and Violet sat on her mother's lap, wide-eyed and delighted, clapping her tiny hands. Zachary watched his wife and daughter, surrounded by friends and neighbors, and thought about how much had changed in 2 years. How a quiet, lonely woman had become the center of a community. How a village that had once been wary of orcs now celebrated one as their own. How love, in the end, had been stronger than fear. As the sun set and the lanterns were lit, Verity caught his eye and smiled, and Zachary knew that everything he had hoped for had come true. They had built a life together, a family, a place where they belonged. And it had all started with a simple wish: to give the woman he loved a birthday. Years passed, and the tradition continued. Every 15th of the 7th month, the village gathered to celebrate Verity. It became one of the highlights of the summer, a day when everyone set aside their work and came together to eat and dance and remember why they were a community. Violet grew up knowing that her mother was special, not because she was an orc, but because she was loved. When Violet was 5, she asked her father why they celebrated her mother's birthday when they did not know the real day. Zachary knelt down so he was at her level and said, "Because your mother never had a birthday before. So we chose a day, and we made it special. It does not matter when she was born. What matters is that we celebrate her." Violet thought about this, then nodded. "I think that is nice. So do I." Violet hugged him, her small arms tight around his neck, and Zachary held her and thought about how lucky he was. Lucky to have Verity, lucky to have Violet, lucky to have a life filled with love and laughter and purpose. That evening, after the celebration had ended and the guests had gone home, Zachary and Verity sat on the porch with Violet between them. The little girl had fallen asleep, her head on her mother's lap, and Verity stroked her hair gently. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" Verity asked. "What do you mean?" "If you had not decided to give me a birthday, if the village had not come together, if Garrett had succeeded in turning people against me." Zachary was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think things turned out the way they were supposed to." "You really believe that?" "I do. I think we were meant to find each other. I think we were meant to build this life." Verity smiled, a soft, contented smile. "I think so too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one, and Zachary felt a deep, abiding gratitude for the choices he had made, the risks he had taken, the love he had found. He thought about the man he had been before Verity, quiet and solitary, content but not truly happy. And he thought about the man he was now, a husband and a father, part of a family and a community, his life richer and fuller than he had ever imagined possible. As the night grew darker and the air cooler, Verity stood, carefully lifting Violet into her arms. "We should get her to bed." Zachary followed them inside, closing the door against the night. He lit a lamp and watched as Verity tucked Violet into her cradle, smoothing the blanket Alina had made and pressing a kiss to her forehead. Then she turned to him, and he saw in her eyes the same gratitude, the same love, the same quiet joy. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For everything. For loving me, for giving me a family, for making me feel like I belong." Zachary crossed to her and took her hands. "You have always belonged, I just helped you see it." They stood together in the lamplight, and Zachary thought about all the birthdays yet to come, all the celebrations and gatherings, all the moments of joy and connection. He thought about growing old with Verity, watching Violet grow and maybe having more children, building a legacy of love and acceptance in a world that too often chose fear and division. And he knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that he would never regret the choice he had made. To love Verity, to fight for her, to give her the one thing she had never had. A day that was hers alone, a celebration of her existence, a reminder that she mattered. It was, in the end, the best decision he had ever made. The following summer, on the 15th of the 7th month, the village gathered once again. By now it had become a beloved tradition, and people looked forward to it as much as any other festival. There was always music and dancing, always too much food, always laughter and warmth and a sense of togetherness that carried through the rest of the year. This time, Zachary noticed something new. More families had come, some from neighboring villages who had heard about the celebration and wanted to see it for themselves. There were even a few orcs among the guests, friends of Verity's who had traveled from the east. They stood a little apart at first, uncertain, but Verity greeted them with joy and introduced them to everyone, and soon they were laughing and talking with the rest. Zachary watched from the edge of the square, his heart full. He saw Verity in the center of it all, radiant and confident, Violet at her side. He saw Martin and Alina, now with a son of their own, dancing together to Jonas Quinby's fiddle. He saw old Peter Quill, gray and stooped but still smiling, teaching a group of children how to carve. He saw Sarah Quinn and Thomas Quillan and Martha Quilby and a dozen others, all of them part of something larger than themselves, and he thought about how easy it would have been to do nothing. To let Verity's birthday pass unmarked, to accept that she had never celebrated it and never would. To let fear and prejudice dictate the terms of their lives, but he had not done nothing. He had acted, had taken a risk, had asked for help even when it was hard, and because of that, everything had changed. Alina came over and stood beside him, her son balanced on her hip. "You look thoughtful." "Just remembering." The first celebration, yes, Alina smiled. "That was a good day, a hard day, but a good one, it was. You know, people still talk about your speech, about how you stood up there and told everyone how much Verity meant to you. It was not like you." Zachary laughed. "No, it was not. But it mattered. It made people see that you were serious, that this was not just some gesture, that you really loved her. I do. I know. We all know." They stood together watching the celebration, and then Alina said, "You should join them. This is your day too." "It is Verity's day. It is both of yours. You made it happen." Zachary nodded and walked into the square. Verity saw him coming and held out her hand, and he took it, pulling her close. They danced together, awkward and laughing, and Violet danced around them, spinning in circles until she was dizzy. The sun set and the lanterns were lit, and the party continued long into the night. When it finally ended, Zachary and Verity walked home with Violet asleep on Zachary's shoulder, the village quiet behind them. The road was familiar, the fields golden in the moonlight, and the air was warm and still. At home, they put Violet to bed and then stood together on the porch as they had so many times before. Verity leaned against Zachary, her head on his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her. "I am so happy," she said. "So am I. Do you think it will always be like this?" "I think it will be different, but I think we will always have each other, and that is enough." Verity looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Yes, it is." They stayed there for a long time, holding each other under the stars, the world peaceful and full of promise. And Zachary knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from lived experience, that he had given Verity not just a birthday but a life. A life where she was valued and celebrated, where she belonged, where she was loved. And that was everything. Over the next few years, the village continued to grow and change. New families moved in, drawn by the reputation of a place where people of all kinds were welcome. Verity became something of a local leader, organizing work parties to repair roads and build a new bridge over the river. She taught children how to fish and tan hides, passing on skills she had learned as a girl. She was elected to the village council, the first orc to hold such a position, and she served with grace and wisdom. Zachary watched her with pride and admiration. She had blossomed in ways he could never have predicted, had become not just a part of the community but a cornerstone of it. And yet she remained the same person he had fallen in love with. Kind, strong, unpretentious, always quick to help those in need. Violet grew into a bright, curious child with her mother's determination and her father's quiet thoughtfulness. She had friends of all kinds, human and orc and everything in between, and she moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had never been taught to see differences as barriers. She loved her mother's birthday celebrations, loved the music and the food and the sense of joy that filled the village every summer. When Violet was 7, she asked if she could help plan the celebration. "What would you like to do?" Verity asked. "I want to make decorations. And I want to help bake the cake." "Then you will." They spent the week before the 15th of the 7th month working together, cutting paper into shapes and stringing them on twine, mixing batter and spreading frosting. Violet took her responsibilities seriously, her tongue poking out in concentration as she worked, and Verity felt a surge of love so strong it brought tears to her eyes. On the day of the celebration, Violet stood beside her mother in the village square, beaming with pride as people admired the decorations. "I made those," she told anyone who would listen. "Me and Ma." Zachary stood nearby, talking with Martin, and he felt a deep, abiding contentment. This was what he had wanted, not just a birthday for Verity, but a tradition, a legacy, something that would last beyond them. And it had worked. The celebration was no longer just about Verity. It was about the village, about the bonds they had built, about the kind of community they wanted to be. As the party began, Violet ran off to play with her friends, and Verity came to stand beside Zachary. "She is so proud. She should be. She did a wonderful job." Verity slipped her hand into his. "I never imagined this, any of this. Neither did I. But here we are, here we are." They stood together, watching the celebration unfold, and Zachary thought about how far they had come. From a quiet wedding in a village that had barely accepted Verity to this. A gathering of friends and neighbors, a celebration of love and community, a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. It was more than he had hoped for, more than he had dared to dream. As the evening wore on and the music played and the laughter rang out across the square, Zachary felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find an older man, someone he did not recognize, standing behind him. "Are you Zachary Quinlan?" the man asked. "I am. I am Simon Quent. I live in the next village over. I heard about this celebration and I wanted to come see it for myself." "You are welcome here," Simon smiled. "Thank you. I brought my daughter. She is an orc like your wife. She has had a hard time in our village. People are not as open-minded as they are here." Zachary glanced past Simon and saw a young orc woman standing at the edge of the square, her arms wrapped around herself, her expression uncertain. "Bring her over," Zachary said. "I will introduce her to Verity." Simon's face lit up and he waved his daughter over. She came slowly, hesitantly, and Zachary could see the wariness in her eyes. He understood it. He had seen it in Verity once, a long time ago. "This is my daughter, Vera," Simon said. "It is nice to meet you," Zachary said. "Come, I will introduce you to my wife." He led them through the crowd to where Verity was standing, talking with a leaner. "Verity, this is Vera. She and her father are visiting from the next village." Verity's face softened and she held out her hand. "It is wonderful to meet you. Please stay, enjoy the celebration." Vera took her hand and Zachary saw the tension ease from her shoulders. "Thank you. Of course. This is a day for everyone." Vera smiled, a small, tentative smile, and Zachary felt a flicker of hope. Maybe what they had built here could spread. Maybe other villages would see that it was possible to welcome everyone, to build communities based on acceptance rather than fear. It was a big dream, maybe too big. But as he watched Vera join the celebration, as he saw her laugh and talk and begin to relax, he thought that maybe, just maybe, it could happen. The celebration continued late into the night, and when it finally ended, Zachary and Verity and Violet walked home together under a sky full of stars. Violet chattered about the party, about the cake and the music and the games she had played with her friends. Verity listened with a smile, her hand in Zachary's, and Zachary felt a peace that went deeper than words. At home, they tucked Violet into bed, and then they sat together on the porch as they always did. The night was warm, the air filled with the sound of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. "That was a good day," Verity said. "It was. I never thought I would have this. A family, a community. A day that is mine. You deserve all of it." Verity leaned her head on his shoulder. "I know, I finally believe that." Zachary kissed the top of her head and they sat in comfortable silence, the world peaceful around them. He thought about all the years ahead, all the celebrations yet to come, all the moments of joy and love and connection. He thought about growing old with Verity, watching Violet grow and have a family of her own, building a legacy that would last for generations. And he knew, with a certainty that filled his entire being, that he had done the right thing, not just in giving Verity a birthday, but in loving her, in fighting for her, in building a life with her. It had not always been easy. There had been obstacles and setbacks, moments of doubt and fear. But they had faced them together and they had won, because love, in the end, was stronger than anything else. Stronger than prejudice, stronger than fear, stronger than the voices that said they did not belong together. Love had made a way where there was no way. Love had built a community where there had been only suspicion. Love had given Verity a birthday, and so much more. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, Zachary held Verity close and thought about the future. It stretched out before them, bright and full of promise, a road they would walk together, hand in hand, for all the days to come. And that was the greatest gift of all.